All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be diving deep into how modern Germany grapples with its Nazi past. We've
Ooh,
got,
that's a heavy one.
I know, right? A really fascinating mix of sources here. Some personal stories, historical analysis, all kind of exploring how this history isn't just something that's like in the books for them. It's something that's still shaping Germany today.
Yeah, and what's really striking to me is that it's not just about remembering what happened, right? It's about how that past informs Germany's identity, its actions in the world today, its place on the global stage.
You know, one of the stories that really jumped out at me was about this young German guy visiting the Normandy war cemeteries. And I mean, you can just imagine the emotions, the
Yeah.
weight of history he must have been feeling.
Absolutely. He actually describes an encounter with an older Frenchman, someone who had most likely lived through the war.
Wow.
And the man's advice to him was so powerful. He said, "It wasn't you. You were not born.
Wow.
Let go."
It's such a powerful statement. It really kind of gets at this tension that we see throughout a lot of the sources. This idea of how do you acknowledge the immense gravity of the past without burdening every individual with this like personal guilt?
Right. And that leads us right into how Germany approaches education about this period. Because from what I'm seeing in these sources, they don't shy away at all. They really go straight into those darkest chapters.
Hmm.
For example, school trips to concentration camps are actually a part of the curriculum starting as young as age 10.
That's pretty different from how I remember learning about the Holocaust in school. It was covered, of course, but it wasn't nearly as immersive or direct.
Yeah, one source I read described a curriculum where students are analyzing primary sources from the Nazi period,
Wow.
like letters from soldiers, propaganda posters, things that really force them to engage with that time.
So it's like they're not just told what happened, but they have to kind of figure out like how it happened, how individuals made choices, how systems enabled those choices.
Exactly. It's about fostering critical thinking, right? Equipping these young people to be able to recognize the warning signs, the slippery slopes that can lead to such horrors.
That's really interesting. It's like giving them the tools to analyze not just history, but also like current events to see those parallels.
Exactly. The sources also talk about how there's been a real evolution in how the Nazi past is framed within Germany itself. Back in the 1950s, the focus was much more on this idea of collective guilt, the burden carried by the generation that actually lived through the war.
Makes sense.
But by the 1990s, you see a shift. There's this rejection of both Nazism and communism, a reemergence of German patriotism, but within a very different context. It's a patriotism rooted in a unified Germany, a Germany firmly embedded within the European Union.
So it's like patriotism, but not in that like nationalistic, aggressive way that we often associate with the past.
Exactly. It's interesting.
And it seems like today it's less about guilt and more about turning it into a history lesson, a cautionary tale with this strong emphasis on never again.
And that never again sentiment isn't just rhetoric. It's deeply embedded in Germany's actions on the world stage, right? Like, they've been a strong advocate for human rights, a staunch supporter of international institutions. Yeah. It's like they're actively trying to use their history as a lesson, not just for themselves, but for the whole world.
It's almost like trying to turn that really negative part of their history into something positive.
Yeah, trying to make something good come out of it.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how this all ties into this idea of soft power that pops up in the sources. It's like instead of projecting strength through military might, now Germany is known for its exports, its technological innovation, its cultural contributions.
Right, and that shift is totally deliberate. The sources suggest it's a very conscious strategy. Like Germany's investment in cultural diplomacy through things like the Goethe Institute, it's all aimed at reshaping global perceptions and promoting understanding.
So it's like they're using culture as a tool to build bridges instead of walls.
Exactly. They've even moved away from traditional military marches and now primarily use Prussian marches, which emphasize regional pride over nationalistic fervor.
That's interesting. I'd never thought about that. It's all very calculated and strategic. It's a fascinating example of a nation really trying to redefine itself on the world stage.
Yeah, it's a powerful example of how a nation's image can evolve. But it's not just policies and global image, right? This history is also woven into the physical landscape of Germany. The sources are filled with descriptions of memorials, preserved ruins, reminders literally built into their cities.
Right. It's like you can't escape it. It's everywhere.
Well, one thing that stood out to me was these Stolpersteine, these little bronze cobblestones embedded in the pavement in front of homes where victims of the Nazis once lived.
I've seen pictures of those. They're so powerful.
Yeah, it's a really powerful concept. They're designed to make you literally stumble, to interrupt your everyday life, and force you to confront this history head-on.
Like a physical reminder that you can't just ignore.
Exactly. You're walking down the street going about your day, and then suddenly you're face-to-face with a name, a date, a reminder that this happened. Right here, in this very spot.
Wow.
It's such a visceral way of keeping that memory alive, of refusing to let it be forgotten. And it's not just the Stolperstein. They also talk about these preserved ruins of bombed buildings, untouched graffiti from the war years and the Reichstag building museums dedicated to confronting this history. There's this conscious effort to keep those reminders present, to make them part of the everyday experience of living in Germany.
It's like they're saying, this is a part of who we are. We can't just erase it. We have to live with it.
Exactly. And it speaks to a much larger question that a lot of these sources are wrestling with.
Yeah.
How do you remember? How do you commemorate? How do you learn from this history without being completely overwhelmed by it?
That's a tough one. And it's not like they found one perfect answer, right? There's still debate, especially with the rise of right-wing sentiment and groups like Pegida in recent times.
Yeah, that's a really important point. There's a real fear in some of these sources that history could repeat itself, especially with anxieties about immigration, economic instability, the kinds of things that can make people vulnerable to extremist ideologies.
So it's like this constant push and pull, this tension between wanting to move forward, but also recognizing that the past isn't really past. It's still there lurking in the shadows.
It's like they're walking a tightrope, trying to acknowledge the darkness without letting it consume them. And it makes those safeguards within German society all the more crucial.
You mean like the laws we talked about, the 5% rule?
Exactly. Those are all deliberate mechanisms to prevent a backslide, to prevent those extremist ideologies from gaining any real power.
It's like they're building these defenses, but also recognizing that no defense is ever truly foolproof.
Right. It's a constant battle, a constant reminder that democracy is fragile. It requires vigilance, critical thinking, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths.
So it's not just about structures and institutions, it's about individual responsibility as well.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing those warning signs, recognizing those patterns of history that could potentially repeat themselves.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have to learn from history not just as a nation, but as individuals.
And it's not just about Germany, right? These are lessons that apply to all of us.
Absolutely. We all have our own histories, our own legacies to grapple with.
Yeah.
And Germany's experience offers a really powerful example of what it means to try to learn from those legacies, to try to make something positive out of something so horrific.
So it's not just about remembering, it's about using that memory to build a better future.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about recognizing that the past isn't just something that happened. It's something that continues to shape our world today.
And it's about recognizing that we have a choice. We can either let the past define us, or we can use it as a catalyst for positive change.
It's a powerful message, and it's one that we should all take to heart.
It's really interesting, as we dig deeper into these personal accounts, what really strikes me is just how different each person's response to this historical burden is.
Right, it's not like everyone's on the same page about it.
Not at all. You see everything from really intense feelings of guilt to like straight up denial. It's almost like there's no one right way to process this legacy.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's such a complex and heavy thing to deal with.
Absolutely. And you encounter individuals who feel this incredibly deep sense of responsibility, even though they weren't even alive during the Nazi era.
It's like they're trying to make up for what their ancestors did.
Yeah, it's like they carry the weight of their ancestors' actions.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the other side, you have those who just completely reject any notion of responsibility. They say it's ancient history and has nothing to do with them.
It's like two completely opposite reactions.
It really is. It's a fascinating paradox. Yeah, we talked earlier about how Germany has these safeguards in place, like that 5% rule in parliament, to try to prevent those extremist ideologies from gaining a foothold.
Right.
And yet, those ideologies are still around.
Yeah, they haven't disappeared entirely. It's like this constant struggle, this tension between acknowledging the past and trying to move on from it.
It's like this open wound that never fully heals.
I think that's a good way to put it. And these personal accounts really highlight just how much of a psychological and emotional burden this is for a lot of Germans.
It's like they're carrying this weight around with them.
Yeah, some describe it as feeling haunted by the actions of their parents or grandparents.
Wow.
It's this inherited guilt and shame that they feel like they have to deal with.
Some of these stories are really hard to read. It makes you realize that the trauma from this history isn't just something that happened back then. It's still affecting people today.
Absolutely. It ripples through generations.
But even with all this struggle and pain, there's also this incredible resilience that comes through in some of these accounts.
Yeah, there are individuals who are driven by this sense of responsibility.
Like they need to make sure that these stories aren't forgotten.
Exactly. To ensure that the victims aren't just erased from history.
There's one account from a German woman who's dedicated her life to Holocaust education. And she says, "We cannot undo what our ancestors have done, and nothing can remove the stigma from our nation. But we can do our best that something like this does not happen again."
Wow.
It's powerful stuff.
It really is. It speaks to both the lasting impact of this history and the potential for using that history to create positive change.
Right. It's not just about dwelling on the negative. It's about trying to learn from it and make things better.
Yeah, it makes you think about what it really means to learn from history.
Does it mean feeling guilty? Taking action? Preventing it from happening again?
I think it's a combination of all of those things.
Yeah.
It's about understanding how complex the past is, recognizing the choices that individuals and societies made, and understanding how those choices led to where we are today.
It's like connecting the dots between the past and the present.
Exactly.
Hey.
And realizing that the past isn't really separate from the present. It continues to influence our world in so many ways.
Right. It's not like we can just shut the door on it and pretend it never happened.
Exactly. And it's not just about Germany. The lessons we can take from this period are relevant to everyone.
They're universal.
They are. They speak to what humans are capable of, both the good and the bad.
And the importance of protecting those democratic values.
Absolutely. One thing that really stood out to me in these sources was this emphasis on individual responsibility.
Like taking ownership of your actions.
Right. There's a recognition that the Nazi regime didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was built on the choices that individuals made, either by actively participating or by just standing by and letting things happen.
And that's a scary thought.
It is. It makes you think about how any one of us could become complicit in something terrible if we're not careful.
It's that banality of evil idea, right? How normal people can get caught up in doing awful things.
Exactly. And recognizing that potential for evil within ourselves and within our own societies is maybe the most important lesson we can learn from all of this.
So it's like a warning sign.
It is. We need to be aware of those early warning signs and speak out against injustice before it's too late.
It's easy to feel kind of hopeless when you read these accounts. It can be really heavy stuff.
It can be. But there's also this thread of hope running through them.
Oh yeah, I see that too.
This belief that even after experiencing something as horrible as the Holocaust, we can still learn and grow and work towards a better future.
It's like choosing to believe in humanity even when it's hard.
Right. And that's a really powerful message. It's a reminder that even in the face of an immense tragedy, we can still choose hope, choose action, choose to create a world where something like that never happens again.
It's inspiring to see people who are able to find that hope.
It is. It shows that confronting our past, no matter how painful it is, can be the first step towards a brighter future.
And that's a message that applies to everyone, no matter where they're from.
It does. It's a call to action for all of us to look at our own histories, to acknowledge the ways we might be complicit in injustice, and to work towards building a more just and compassionate world.
One thing we haven't really talked about yet is how this historical awareness actually plays out in modern German society.
Oh, that's a good
We
point.
discussed individual reflection and all that, but how does this translate into real actions and policies?
Right. We've mentioned memorials and education, but it goes much deeper than that. It's woven into their whole political system, their legal framework, their cultural landscape, how they approach international relations.
So this awareness isn't just a personal thing. It actually affects how Germany functions as a country.
Exactly. It's not just about remembering what happened.
Yeah.
It's about using that knowledge to try to create a better future.
I think that's a great transition. We've explored how this history affects individuals, and now it's time to look at how it plays out on a larger scale.
Yeah, let's dive into the specifics of how this historical awareness shapes Germany today and in the years to come.
Okay, so we've talked about the personal struggles, the societal shifts, all that. But how does this historical awareness actually manifest in the structure of modern Germany?
One of the most immediate examples is Germany's political landscape. The shadow of the Nazi era, it really looms large over how they approach democracy, governance, even the way their system is structured.
It's like they learn these incredibly hard lessons about freedom and power, how fragile freedom can be and how dangerous unchecked power can be.
Right, and the sources point to several really specific safeguards that were put in place to try to prevent a repeat of the past. Like we talked about the 5% rule in Parliament, which is meant to keep those extremist parties from gaining any real power.
Right, and those strict laws against hate speech, Holocaust denial, any glorification of the Nazi regime, it's like those aren't just laws, they're reflections of this deep-seated societal commitment to preventing history from repeating itself.
Yeah, it's like a proactive approach to democracy. It's not just enough to have elections and a constitution. They've built in these checks and balances, these constant reminders of what can happen when things go wrong.
It's almost like they're saying, never again will we let this happen.
Exactly. And it's also interesting how this awareness shapes the way Germans talk about their national identity. The sources mention a real reluctance to embrace this kind of overt patriotism or to really emphasize Germanness in a way that could be seen as exclusive or aggressive.
It's like they're trying to redefine what it means to be German.
Yeah.
Separate it from that history of militarism and nationalism.
Exactly.
Oh,
One
wow.
source even describes how Germans are much more likely to express like regional pride,
Oh,
identifying as Bavarians or Berliners, for example, rather than putting so much emphasis on their national identity.
Which kind of brings us back to that concept of soft power, right? It's not just about avoiding the negative aspects of their past, but actively trying to project this different image to the world.
Totally. Germany has become a leader in diplomacy, multilateralism, international cooperation. It's almost like they're using their position on the global stage to try to make up for the past, to advocate for a more peaceful and just world order.
We see this in their approach to foreign aid, their support for international organizations, even their willingness to take in refugees. It's a totally different approach to global engagement than what we saw from Germany in the past.
To a 180. It's
Yeah.
like they're trying to make a statement with their actions.
Yeah, and this commitment to international cooperation isn't just about guilt or trying to atone for their past. It seems like a strategic decision based on a real understanding of how interconnected the world is.
Right. They've learned that isolationism and nationalism lead to conflict and instability.
Which makes sense when you think about their history.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's also important to acknowledge that Germany hasn't completely escaped its past. The sources point to some concerning trends, too. Things like the rise of right-wing populism, xenophobia, anxieties about immigration. It's a reminder that those darker impulses are still there, even in a society that's worked so hard to confront them.
There's this quote from a young German activist that I found really powerful. He says, "It feels like we're standing at a crossroads. We can either learn from the mistakes of the past or we can repeat them."
It's a stark warning. It's like he's saying we're not out of the woods yet.
Right. It emphasizes how fragile progress can be and how important it is to actively fight against those forces that want to drag us back into the darkness.
Exactly. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires participation, engagement, a willingness to stand up for what's right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what do you think is the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after listening to all of this?
For me, it comes down to recognizing that history isn't just something we read about in textbooks. It shapes who we are, how we think, how we interact with the world. It's a living, breathing thing.
It's not just dates and facts. It's about people and choices and consequences.
Exactly. And Germany's experience really shows us what it looks like to wrestle with a difficult past, to try to learn from it, to try to build something better.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a responsibility to engage with history honestly and critically, to understand how our own pasts, both personal and collective, shape our present, and to make choices that reflect the kind of future we want to create.
It's a call to action for all of us to be more aware, more informed, more engaged.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this journey. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It really has. It's been a privilege to explore these complex ideas with you. And we hope it's given our listeners something to think about, something to mull over, something to spark their own curiosity.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive, another exploration of history and ideas. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, keep pushing yourself to understand the world around you.
And most importantly, keep believing in the power of hope, the power of change, the power of each and every one of us to make a difference.